All right, we are live. How you doing, Matt?
Yeah, pretty good. How about yourself?
Good, good. You're in California, right?
I'm in Portland, Oregon.
Oh,
Same time zone as
Portland.
California.
Okay, right. Yeah, I think that's why I was confused. Cool. I'm in Thailand, so it's 8:30 in the morning here, 8 o'clock in the morning here, and
Yeah, it's 5 o'clock in the afternoon for me.
yeah, if we
So
have
I
any,
guess it's tomorrow where you are.
yeah, it is. Um, cool. So in this live stream, I just wanted to talk a little bit about your method for
Hmm.
learning languages and sort of see how that applies to what I'm doing right now, learning Thai.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
um, so, want to tell me a little bit about how you learned Japanese first?
Yeah, totally. Well, right before I go in, then I should probably just preface all this with that I have a new website that I recently made with my friend Ethan called Refold. The URL is refold.la for Refold Languages, and on there you can find a really structured um, explanation of my way of learning a language. And so overall, the method is geared towards people who really want to reach as high level as possible, or at least a very high level of fluency. And so if that isn't your goal, then it might not really make sense for you to adopt the method wholesale, but there's probably still a bunch of little tidbits of wisdom that you can apply to your learning no matter what your goals are.
Sure.
So yeah, Refold is definitely largely based off of my experience learning Japanese. And I learned Japanese uh, through a method called AJAT, or All Japanese All the Time.
Hmm.
And actually, the very first 2 years that I tried to learn Japanese, I was just doing the typical stuff like I took classes at my high school and I listened to random tutorial videos on YouTube. Didn't get very far through doing that.
Yeah,
And then it was
typical.
around the 2 year mark that I discovered this blog, All Japanese All the Time, which basically claims that you can reach fluency in a language, even a difficult one like Japanese, relatively quickly on the scale of years, 1, 2, 3 years, if you basically totally surround yourself with the language, listen to it as much as possible, read it as much as possible, and really try to acquire it in a sort of similar way as we acquire a native language. And it's supplemented that pure immersion or exposure to the language with an SRS, or a spaced repetition system. Most people use Anki, and it kind of had this method called sentence mining, where you're not just memorizing a textbook in Anki, or memorizing some list of high frequency words that someone made. You're taking words or sentences that you actually find in the real authentic content you're consuming and making flashcards to learn those. So it's actually a way to help you remember the things that you're picking up from
Hmm.
the authentic language. And so it's kind of this interesting way of adding so a little bit of order to an inherently chaotic process of trying to just pick up the language from authentic content in the language.
Right.
And it had some other components of the philosophy was that you should try to use a monolingual dictionary relatively early on. So, if you're learning Japanese, use a Japanese to Japanese dictionary that's created for native speakers. That helps you learn to start to think in the language and not be constantly relying on your native language to understand your target language. And also had this philosophy of not really putting an emphasis on speaking early on, instead just really focusing on getting input, building up your comprehension, and then kind of the original website, it didn't explicitly say don't speak. It was just kind of saying that the most important thing to focus on early on is comprehension, and feeding your brain lots of input so that it can kind of decode the language, build up a model of how the language works. And then once you kind of have a fleshed out understanding of how that language works, speaking comes pretty naturally. So yeah, I executed the method as closely as I could and got really good results,
Hmm.
and eventually started talking about those results on YouTube.
And did you use that method like living in Japan, or did you do it from the States?
Yeah, so the first 6 months of executing All Japanese All the Time, I was in the States. Second
Hmm.
6 months, I was in Japan on a study abroad. This was when I was in high school. And then after
Okay.
that 6 month period, I was back in the States, and I haven't been actually back to Japan since that 6 month study abroad in 2011.
Hmm. So you were able to reach fluency in Japanese with only actually living in the country for 6 months.
Yeah, and I will say that when I came back from Japan, so 6 months before in the States doing All Japanese All the Time, 6 months in Japan. So I'd been doing it for a year once I got back to the United States, and at that point, I still really couldn't speak Japanese well at all. My
Really?
comprehension was starting to come along, but I really couldn't speak it that well. So I really went from this point of not being fluent in the language to a really strong level of fluency, all without leaving the United States. And I would say it was pretty much around the 3 year mark, counting from when I started All Japanese All the Time, that I reached a pretty strong level of fluency. And I really spent 5 years total doing All Japanese all the time. And the level that I have today, I largely achieved through that 5 year period. And it's been a couple years since I exited that All Japanese All the Time period. And but I wouldn't say, I've just been mostly in maintenance mode, so I haven't really significantly improved since then, I don't think.
Sure. So how much time did you spend doing the All Japanese All the Time, like per day, per week, when you were during that 5 year period?
Probably between 6 to 8 hours a day on average, maybe. Because I really took the All Japanese All the Time to heart, and so there were actually some aspects of it that were a little unhealthy that I wouldn't recommend. Where I almost developed an aversion to English, where and even an aversion to silence, because I was like, every moment of silence is a moment I could be listening to Japanese. So it took me a couple years of exiting the All Japanese All the Time to be comfortable with silence again, because for a while I was like, I need a headphone, where's my headphone, I need to listen to the language more.
I heard that. I had sort of a similar experience. I moved to El Salvador in 2015, and I had some American friends down there, some friends from the United States, and I would I wouldn't avoid them, like I would hang out with them and stuff, but anytime there was a Salvadoran person that I could talk to instead of one of my American friends, I'd go hang out with those people. And my American friends were like, dude, what are you doing? Like, you're like ditching us all the time. And I'm like, yeah, that's because I speak English with you. I ain't trying to speak English all the time. So you say you spent 6 to 8 hours a day. That's not all like active study time, is it?
Yeah, well, the vast majority of that was just consuming content. So basically kind of what my routine would look like is I'd wake up in the morning and I'd spend probably about an hour doing Anki reviews. So that was, out of the whole learning process, sitting there and reviewing my Anki flashcards was the thing that was the most like study-like. And so I did it first thing in the morning to get it out of the way. And then after that, throughout the day, I'd be mostly reading books in Japanese and watching TV shows, maybe watching some YouTube. And then later in the afternoon, I'd make new flashcards that I'd learn the next day, largely. So let's say it would take like maybe 30 minutes to 45 minutes, like making new flashcards. And so it's maybe between 90 minutes to 2 hours a day of actual study. And then the rest of that was just reading things and watching things. And I was looking things up as I went. So there was a study-like component, but it was largely just, consuming media.
Yeah, I hear that. So, like I said earlier, so I'm learning Thai right now. I actually just moved to Thailand. So, in fact, if you hear any strange noises coming from out my window, that's why, because there's like all these weird Thai ice cream trucks and things driving down the road. And they make some really bizarre sounds, actually. It's weird. Anyways, so I lived in Thailand for about 9 months last year. And I think it was sort of similar to, maybe similar to your experience. Before I moved there, I just dove into learning Thai. I probably spent like 5 hours a day, like actively studying Thai, because it was right after I graduated from college. It was just a summer. I didn't have a job. I was preparing to move to Thailand, and I just had like a month or two where I was just doing nothing but learning Thai all day. I didn't have a really good method for doing it though, because in the past I had used like Duolingo and things for learning French, Spanish, Esperanto. And I had all of these apps that I had grown to like in the past. But Thai didn't really have anything. There's no Duolingo course, which I don't really care that much about Duolingo anymore, but there's no link for Thai. There's very few resources available, so I didn't really know what to do. I was kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel. But it sounds like from your experience in your sort of method, you don't use apps, or you don't use.
Not really. So the way that I think about it, to kind of just give the framework, is I think about it where there's basically two different, like very broadly speaking, two different strategies for going about learning to speak a foreign language. One is the more typical one that gets talked about a lot and gets executed a lot, which maybe we want to dub the skill building approach, which is basically where you're reading about the language, memorizing facts about the language, and building a conscious model of how that language works. Yeah. And when you go to speak the language, you're basically thinking in English and then using the conscious model you built to translate English thoughts into the target language. And so this does work, especially if your target language is similar to your native language. And it also can allow you to start speaking and start having conversations very quickly. But it's very limited. First of all, for languages that are very far apart, like I would guess English and Thai, or also English and Mandarin or English Japanese, it really just doesn't work very well. The languages are too different, and when you try to take an English style thought and translate it into Japanese, it just ends up not looking very much like the type of Japanese that Japanese people speak. And so that's one thing. But the other thing is, even for, I think, languages like Spanish or French that are similar to English, when you're starting from English, it can take you pretty far, but eventually you're going to probably run up to this point where, every language is fundamentally different than every other language, and there's unique ways of expressing thoughts, and there's unique kind of intuitions and subtle differences between synonyms and things like that. And at some point, you really have to basically drop the skill building approach and switch into this other approach, which I would call basically the input-based approach or immersion-based approach, which is basically where you're learning to understand the language intuitively, and you're kind of building an intuition for how that language works. And through this kind of intuition, you're able to take your raw thought and turn it straight into the target language without having to go through your native language. It's almost that sounds kind of funny to say, but it's basically you're learning how to think in your target language the first time. And instead of thinking about consciously, like what conjugations to use and things like that, it feels a lot more like speaking your native language, where right now I'm speaking English, I'm getting most of the conjugations right, but if you asked me, technical information about how conjugations work, I couldn't tell you anything about it. It's totally unconscious for me. And so it's a similar type of thing. So in this approach, in my opinion, conscious knowledge still is useful and it still plays a role. But the role that it's playing is not to help you produce the language like it is in the skill building approach, but it's to help you comprehend the language. Because what the linguist Stephen Krashen says in his input hypothesis, which is kind of the base of my philosophy, you acquire language, or you build your unconscious intuition or understanding of the language through comprehending input. And so really the goal becomes, if you want to take this approach, like how do I get to the point where I can comprehend the language and comprehend as much of it as possible? Because that's really how the unconscious mind builds up knowledge and structure about the language. And so in that context, especially as an adult with a developed analytical mind, I think it's very useful to use knowledge as a tool to understand. So the way that I think about it is, like, Stephen Krashen has a lecture actually where he's drawing a picture of Spock, and he's narrating about it in German. And he's saying, okay, here's Spock, here are his ears. You can see he has 2 ears. His ears are pointy. He has 2 eyes. And even if you don't know anything about German, you can comprehend a lot of what he's saying because the visual is making it comprehensible. And so that allows you to acquire more. So just like how that visual can make it more comprehensible, I think the knowledge can make it comprehensible. Like if you've memorized that, like gohan in Japanese means food or rice, then when you hear that word, you can recall that knowledge, and it can make you understand it. And now you've had the experience of comprehending real language. And so basically, if you want to take this style of approach, I still would recommend starting off in a similar manner as you would start off with the skill building approach, where you're still memorizing the most common vocabulary and the grammar structures, just with the difference that, again, the role is not to help you produce the language, but to help you comprehend. So basically, it changes the nature of the studying, because you don't have to, when you're learning a word, right, you don't have to try to memorize the exact nuance of the word. You just have to know roughly what it means, because as long as you know roughly what it means, you're going to understand, combined with context, you're going to understand it when it comes up in real life. And it's through coming across it in multiple different contexts in real life that you'll be able to really grasp exactly what it means. And similar with like conjugations, you just have to be able to recognize the different forms and understand roughly what they mean. You don't have to memorize the formulas that allow you to, run the math in your head and produce them yourself. And so if finally going to like Thai, what I'd recommend is try to find whatever textbooks you can, even if they're outdated or, kind of sparse, and learn all the content in there. My preferred way is to, make Anki cards, but you can use whatever study method works for you. And then after that, it's really diving into media. So, I would say you want to find real, authentic Thai media, but of course, some of the media is going to be easier to learn from than other media. Like if you have shows, not for infants, but more like children to adolescent type TV shows, those tend to be more comprehensible. And so you could find some of those. And really, if you can find something with target language subtitles, that really helps, because it's a lot easier to, it makes it easier to look up words. Yeah. And so the real key is, can you find a dictionary? Like if you can find a Thai to English dictionary that will allow you to start kind of chipping away at real content, then that's really all you need, I would say, because definitely there are Thai to Thai dictionaries. So you just need in terms of resources for a learner, all you need is a Thai to English dictionary that can get you far enough where you can actually just start using the Thai to Thai dictionary, and now you don't need learner resources at all. So what I would say is you're going to jump into some show, maybe it's a kid's show, and of course at the beginning you're not going to understand that much, but try to find some sentences that you can almost understand. And like if there's a sentence that just has multiple unknown words, have no idea what it means, skip over that, but try to find a sentence that is within reach, you almost understand it, and then look up the unknown word in a dictionary. And if that allows you to understand the sentence, then take that sentence and make an Anki card for it, so that you can retain the knowledge that you just gleaned from authentic content. And so you basically just do that. That's how you'll grow your real understanding of how words work in context, how grammar works in context. And then another thing I like to do is, after you've actively consumed a TV show, then you can put it on your phone and listen to it passively throughout the day. That will help you reinforce what you learn and get better at listening. And so you basically just do this process of learning from media itself until you build up your comprehension. And once you have pretty good comprehension, you'll be able to start kind of just mimicking it yourself and learning to speak through mimicry, basically.
Sure. Cool. Yeah. So, that's a lot of good information there. So you briefly talked about how when you first start learning the language, and first start watching content, you're not going to understand very much of it, right? So what do you do there? Because you mentioned, like, it's okay if you don't understand, just look up some of the words. I've kind of exhausted a lot of the very beginner level resources in Thai, and I'm at the worst, like most awkward stage of learning Thai, because I've gone through all the beginner resources. Like, yes, I already know how to say hello, how are you? I know how to, how to order food from the restaurant, but I'm not at the point yet where I don't feel like I could even watch even a kid's show, really. It's designed for native speakers who are children, unless there's English subtitles with it. Yeah.
Well, what I would say is that if you look at Japanese learners, Japanese learners are the most blessed language learners in the world when it comes to resources. There's, an unlimited number of grammar books that go up to the highest levels, and all these different learner resources. And there's lots of Japanese learners, I would say most, that are serious. They have this experience of, they just study and study and study. They go through resource after resource after resource, and they get to this point where they could probably write their own Japanese textbook. Yet, when they turn on a real TV show, they don't understand it, because
Sure.
that's a different skill. You know, it's kind of like, imagine you sit down and you read 10 books on how to swim, and you become a master on explaining how swimming works, but you've never been in a pool before.
Right.
So there's a lot of language where it's a very embodied skill. On the surface it looks like it's about knowledge and it's like an intellectual, you know, discipline, but it's really not. Real language ability is something that's very embodied. It's more like almost like a physical skill, like swimming. And so I would say it, in a way, your situation's not as bad as you might think it would be. I'd say you're not even that much worse off than Japanese learners. I think what you're mostly experiencing is just how hard it is to learn a language that is completely unrelated to any of the languages that you already know. Mm-hmm. And what I would say is that it's there's this concept we talk a lot about on the Refold website called tolerating ambiguity, which is basically this idea that, yeah, when you first start watching TV shows, you're not going to understand that much, and that's going to be really annoying and uncomfortable at the beginning because as adults, we're used to pretty much understanding everything that happens, and we actually get conditioned through the schooling process to, you know, never move on to the next thing until you've already mastered the stage that you're at, and things like this. And language learning just can't work that way because it's too much of a messy, chaotic process. You have to be okay with not understanding a lot and kind of working your way through the murkiness. And so, you know, like when you, for the other day, I watched The Incredibles for the first time in probably 15 years. It was a really great movie. When I was a kid, I watched The Incredibles probably 10 times or more. And there were so many jokes and things that I understood when I watched The Incredibles a couple weeks ago that totally went over my head as a kid. And so it's just so interesting to realize, oh, I was not getting very much of this at all. Like, very important plot points were going over my head, but it didn't bother me because when you're a kid, you're used to not understanding stuff, and you just are curious. You just take what you can get. But so I think a lot of it is kind of learning to return to the beginner's mind or be able to process what's going on like children. And part of this involves, you know, I would say, even with the tide that you already know, if you watch that children's show, most of it you're not going to understand, but you are going to understand some stuff, and probably more than you would think. Like, especially, I can imagine the two of us sitting and watching a Thai show, I would understand literally zero. And there'd be quite a few things where you're like, oh, no, that's what they say when they greet each other. Or like, oh, no, that's the word for, you know, music. He must be talking about music or something. So that'd be significantly more than me. And so if you shift your mindset from how much you don't understand to what you are understanding, it can be pretty cool because what you're consuming is real, authentic material. It's not something created for a learner. So if you think that, like, yeah, I'm not understanding that much, but what I am understanding, that's pretty cool. That's real. I can work with this. I can expand this out and eventually get there. So I think a lot of it is just learning to accept the ambiguity and start to focus on, like, the kind of cup half full mindset, or at least cup isn't 100% empty mindset, basically.
Yeah. Sure. So one of the things that I have been doing just over the last few weeks is anytime I'm doing that doesn't take my full concentration, you know, whether I'm you know, doing the dishes or just cleaning or something, I feel like YouTube is very lacking for comprehensible input for anyone who's studying less than already, if they're less than already fluent. But I did find a website or a YouTube channel called Thai Audiobooks for All Blinds. And it's a really funny name for a YouTube channel, but it's just audiobooks in Thai that have been, well, most of them have been translated from English, but I'll just put that on and I'll listen to some stories. You know, it has like Harry Potter and Chronicles of Narnia, Mary Poppins and things like that. And I listen through some of these stories. I know they're translated, so maybe that goes against some of the things.
No. It's still meant for natives to consume, right?
Yeah. Okay. Right. So, and I've been listening to the Chronicles of Narnia on this website, on this YouTube channel, and I understand, like, I'll catch like 2 or 3 words per sentence. And just because I'm already so familiar with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I'm able to follow along with, I know which point in the story we're at because I just heard them say beaver, or I just heard them say, you know, witch or something like that. And that's cool. That's it's kind of an empowering experience to at least be able to go through and understand that much. Do you find it hard, though, to go through an entire work of, whether it's a film or a TV show or audiobook or whatever, understanding only 1 to 2 words per sentence or 3 words per sentence? Does your interest ever start to wane?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, especially at the beginning. I mean, basically, the better you get, the more enjoyable it is because the more you understand. And so, yeah, definitely, there's no way around it being a little bit of a grind at the beginning. That's definitely the case. It's never going to be as fun as watching your favorite show in your native language at the beginning. But I would say that, like, I'm a huge fan of passive listening, like I mentioned. But I think if you could find some Thai show, like I said, with Thai subtitles. I don't know if Thai is if Netflix or something, but that really allows you to look things up. And if you can look things up, then you're growing your knowledge in real time. And that makes it a little bit more of an active activity. Like if you're just listening while you're doing the dishes, that's completely passive. But if you're watching the subtitles and you can pause, you can look things up, you can kind of try to puzzle out the language and combine that with the visual context, because you can tell a lot about what's going on in a show. Like if you watched most movies with the sound off, you could probably tell someone who hadn't seen the movie at all quite a bit about it. What characters are there, who is in love with who, all these things. So that also gives you a lot of information. And so I think when you combine that, you're already going to understand some stuff. The visuals can be stimulating and interesting, tell you even more stuff. And then you actually have this kind of, it's almost you're turning it into a puzzle game as you go. You're trying to understand these sentences. And also you're making Anki cards. If you do that as well, then now you have some kind of like a result you can point to of like, hey, I spent an hour watching and I have like 15 cards. And if you, that's the cool thing about Anki, is it really allows you to quantify your improvement. Because if you do your Anki reviews every day, and Anki can guarantee you like a 90% retention rate if you tweak the settings right, then hey, I have added 100 words to this, and I could tell you at least 90 of them right now if you quiz me. So it's something really tangible and quantifiable that you can have in addition to the otherwise totally chaotic and nebulous process, right? And so I think, and at the beginning, don't try to do 8 hours a day right off the bat. Got to build up to it. So start with a half an hour a day, and then when that becomes normal, you get a little better, can maybe span it to an hour or two, and maybe you can only do an hour a day until you get to the more intermediate level where you're understanding more. I think that's totally, reasonable.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. One thing that I have been doing is watching Thai Netflix with English subtitles. And, I feel like that's been sort of helpful.
Yeah, like what I would say with that is that the cool thing about that is you're building up, like I think the act of watching something with subtitles it has some language learning benefit. You're passively listening to the language. You're probably going to pick up some stuff about the vocabulary. It also can get you very excited about the language and the culture if you like the show and you enjoy it. It also helps, but I'd say one of the most powerful benefits is that you're building a library of Thai content that you already know what's going on. So later, when you get a little further down the line, you could rewatch that show and take the English subtitles off, and you're already going to know what's going on. So you're not going to be lost, and that can be really valuable as well.
Right. Yeah.
And then also one last thing is then if you watch the show with English subtitles, you know what's going on. You can then take that same audio and listen to it and repeat on the background, and it will be more comprehensible. Right. Like with the sound effects and the music, you'll be able to tell what scene is going on, just like what you said with the Narnia, and then you can benefit from that repetition as well.
Sure. Yeah. I made a video and I mentioned that about a week or two ago, where I said, I've been watching YouTube with English subtitles, and instantly people were like, if you're using English subtitles, you're not learning at all because you're just paying attention to the English subtitles. And to tell you the truth, though, I'm not actually watching the show to learn Thai. I was watching the show in quarantine, so I spent 2 weeks straight in a hotel room without stepping foot outside the door. Right. So it's like I had to do something during those 2 weeks. And I'm like, all right, I'm going to watch Netflix. And as long as I'm watching Netflix, I'm going to at least listen to something in Thai, even if I'm not actively studying the language. And it was cool. Most of it is reading. I'm not actively focusing on learning Thai, but every once in a while they'd be in a situation and I would just hear like a one word sentence or I would catch a word in the sentence and and then I just have a little moment of noticing how Thai people use that phrase. But now that you mention actively studying using the subtitle, like using Thai subtitles, I think I might actually see. I'm glad we had this interview. I think I'm going to actually go back and watch some of these shows again using the Thai subtitles because I already understand the message now. Like I know what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to be left behind.
Yeah, totally. And I just one other note on watching the English subtitles. Like I think so much of language learning comes down to habits, right? Because we're not going to be motivated all the time, and so I think in a way, if you're a monolingual English speaker, basically, I think we could say we're all addicted to English. So overcoming that English addiction is something that's going to be really useful to your language learning. So I think that watching target language shows with English subtitles is going to be a good intermediary step. Like, for example, if you're someone who is new to language learning and you used to watch Netflix in English all the time, and you're used to like always watching the new show when it comes out, or always watching the new season when it comes out, so you can talk about it with all your friends at the water machine, whatever they call it.
Water cooler.
Yeah, the water cooler. Then, that's from a language learner's point of view, it's very hard to justify all that time spent in English, right? That's prime time that you could spend on language learning. And probably one of the initial barriers you're going to have to overcome is at the water cooler going to be, hey, did you see Game of Thrones, whatever? It'd be like, no, I didn't. Like, because you're going to be watching target language shows. So, and I think that's a significant thing for a lot of people. So, if watching with English subtitles helps you take a step in that direction, I think that can be totally beneficial.
Cool. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna give people a few opportunities here to ask questions. So if you're in the comments and you have any questions, go ahead and ask those now. But before we get to that point, do you ever do any like just reading in your target language, or do you recommend that, or do you do mostly TV shows? Like, what do you feel about books?
Yeah. Well, when I was learning Japanese, so initially. I found in Japanese that books were really hard compared to TV shows. There's just a lot of, in Japanese in particular, there's a lot of vocabulary that pretty much only shows up in literature and not in TV shows. So for a while, I was sticking to TV shows because that was what I was within reach, basically. But probably from within, after about maybe 7-8 months of doing all Japanese all the time, I started reading books, and that was a big part of my learning process. And I feel like that really helped with my vocabulary. And right now I'm studying Mandarin Chinese, and I'm mostly focused on TV shows right now. It's in my case in particular, Chinese uses the same characters as Japanese, well, the original Chinese characters. And so I have this huge advantage coming to Chinese where I could basically read 25% of Chinese before I ever started studying it. So by default, it's way easier for me to read compared to listening. And so I pretty much stick to TV shows for now because I know if all things equal, I'm going to be really biased towards reading anyway. So I'm trying to balance that out with listening. And I also think that listening a lot in the beginning is important for developing pronunciation because, pronunciation really comes from listening. It's hard to produce something if you can't hear it. And so I think in the beginning, just for that pronunciation consideration combined with how in general TV shows are more accessible, I think it's good for probably the first 6 months, to stick to TV shows, but then later on, adding reading more into the mix, and eventually, balancing reading and listening is what I'd recommend. But I think ultimately, if you're someone who really likes reading or is excited about reading, and you're okay jumping into reading at the beginning, even though you're going to understand very little, then totally go for it. It's just that, like with the ambiguity stuff that I talked about, it's a lot easier to watch a TV show and understand 20% than to read a book and understand 20%. That's really going to be uphill battle. So
right. Do you have any experience reading like manga or anything like that where it's giving you some of the context through images or anything like that?
Yeah, I read a little manga early on, but I think for me, in Japanese in particular, most popular manga have an anime adaptation. And so it kind of felt like if I I could read a manga, like I could read Naruto or One Piece, or I could watch Naruto and One Piece with Japanese subtitles. And in that case, it's almost the same experience, except I get to hear the pronunciation as well. And then later I can listen to it passively after I watch it. So it kind of just felt more optimal for learning. So I focused on the anime. But actually, in Refold, we have this framework of input channels where we kind of say that there's three different possible input channels: audio, text, and then visuals. And so the more channels you have in general, the more comprehensible something's going to be. So if you're watching a TV show with target language subtitles, it has all three channels, right? You have the visuals, you have the audio, and then you have the subtitles. So that's the most comprehensible. Then you can have either a two-channel input, which would be either a TV show with no subtitles, or something like a manga, where you do have the text, you also have the visuals. So that's going to be a little more challenging. And then the most challenging thing in general is it's either just text, or just literature, no pictures at all, or pure audio, like a podcast or an audiobook with no supports at all to give you hints as to what they're saying.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. Here, Dylan Robertson says, any novel recommendations for Japanese that you particularly enjoyed?
Yeah, one of my favorite novels is called, well, in English, it's called Welcome to the NHK, or NHK ni Yokoso. It's about a hikikomori which is basically someone who's a shut-in and they're afraid to leave their house. Really interesting kind of first person view of the psychology of that. I also like Murakami Haruki in general. Some people love him, some people hate him. But I think one of my favorite Murakami Haruki books was Sekai no Owari to Hard-boiled Wonderland. The End of the World and Hard-Boiled Wonderland, or something like that.
Hard-boiled Wonderland?
Yeah. Really, really interesting book. And let me see. In general, I also like the authors Morimi Tomihiko and Higashi no Keigo. Type of stuff.
Cool. So we've been talking a little bit about reading, reading on Anki and reading on the subtitles on Netflix or YouTube or whatever. Do you have any recommendations for people who are learning a script different than their native language script who, I don't know how Japanese works, but I know for sure if I was watching even a basic children's show with just Thai script, I would be totally lost because I don't know what any of these letters are.
Yeah. Well, I think it probably depends a lot on what the particular script is, because if you're learning Japanese or Chinese, you have this challenge of 2,000 plus characters that you need to learn. And so on my old website, Mass Immersion Approach, I talked about my particular preferred method of going about learning the kanji. It really needs to be addressed as its own thing. And eventually it'll be on Refold as well. It's just the site's new, so we haven't converted it over yet. But and so yeah, I think to a certain degree you have to tackle it on a per language basis. Depends what the particular challenge of that writing system is. But I believe Thai it's still a phonetic alphabet, right? And so what I would probably do is like learn the alphabet, learn what all the different spelling conventions are and everything like that. And probably first just try to get really comfortable with it. Like I'd probably spend like 50 minutes a day just like reading a text out loud, even if I have no idea what it says, just to try to get super comfortable with the characters. And then after that, like, what I do like with Chinese when I'm reading a TV show is I'll actually pause after each line and take some time to however much time I need to read that line. And if you're talking about Netflix, there's a free extension called Language Learning with Netflix that you can get for Chrome, and it has a mode where it will automatically pause the show for you after each line, and also allow you to click words and look them up.
I'll have to go check that out. Cool. All right. Mustafa says, is there anything to speed up the process once you start getting advanced and learning becomes really slow and slower or even hard to notice?
Well, so in terms of actually speeding up the process, I think the only thing you can do is spend more time with the language total. And if you're struggling with vocabulary, Anki worked really well for me. So what I did was I made 10 Anki cards almost every single day for about 5 years straight. And this meant that I was learning at least 10 words every single day. In reality, I was learning a lot more because there's a lot of words I just learned, I picked up through osmosis, or I just looked them up once and remembered them. So I was actually learning more than that, but I was definitely learning at least 10 words a day. So I'd maybe choose the 10 that seemed the hardest to just pick up and make actual cards for those. So I ended up with close to 20,000 Anki cards. And at that point, I found that I knew a lot of words that even native speakers didn't know. Because I was reading books that used a lot of hard vocabulary, and I just learned every single word, whereas natives tend to just skip over words they don't know most of the time. So, yeah, I'd say if the vocabulary is the issue, and that's what you mean by slow progress, I'd say that's Anki is a good way to do that if you just use it consistently over time, and then more time spent with the language. And if your other problem is more like psychological because you feel like you're not getting anywhere, I'd say a good technique is if you're still mainly focused on comprehension and you can't understand really well yet, then every couple months go and consume something that you consumed a couple months ago, so that you can really have a comparison as to how much your comprehension's improved. Because what I find is that even at low levels, when you're improving really quickly, we acclimate to our ability really quickly. It's pretty much like getting taller. You never notice when you're a little kid that you've grown an inch in the past couple months until you do that thing where you go and draw a line on the doorway and compare it to before. So I think a good way to do that with language learning is go back and watch something that you watched a couple months ago. That will give you a real comparison. And if you're mainly focused on speaking, then record a video of yourself every couple months so that you can go back and watch the other video and see how much you've improved.
Yeah, that makes 100% sense. Paul says, does Thai have spaces between the words? And no, it's just all words, all letters run together. You have to try to figure out where one word ends and one word begins. Okay, so Rachel Harris says, as someone who is totally blind, how could I go about MIA? I feel that not accessing visual aids, i.e. from movies, would make content less comprehensive. Do you have any advice for that?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to give an answer because I'm not really familiar with what technology is available to blind people. Like, I know that there is a lot of technology that allows them to actually use the internet. Like, I'm assuming this person seems to be using the internet, right? But I'm not familiar enough with it to really give concrete advice, unfortunately. It really would come down to what particular technology is available to you, I think.
Sure. Yeah, Rachel, there's a YouTuber and a podcaster named Chanel Hansen, who is also blind. And so she sometimes does videos and gives information about just what she does and how she's overcome some of those obstacles. Might be something to look into. So going back to Anki, when you create the cards on Anki, do you typically do single words or full phrases?
So I've done it different ways. When I was learning Japanese, my cards looked like they had a whole sentence or phrase on the front of the card, and then on the back of the card was the definition of the unknown word. And I would read the whole sentence and process it. The way I've been doing it recently for Chinese is I have the whole sentence on the back and I just have the target word on the front. I find that it's having a sentence somewhere on the card is extremely useful because a lot of times you just like there's so many, like, for example, I suck at coming up with these kind of examples on the spot, but let's say that you're learning English and like, for example, you have the word like quickly. Like, normally we wouldn't say like I run quickly. You would say like I run fast, like, or I'm like a fast runner. So if you had the word quickly and you had some example sentence of like clean up your room quickly or something, it tells you a lot about how the words actually use, how it actually means. So, and also it just creates a stronger memory, because if you just have like like, for example, like in Japanese, like quick equals hayai. That is, it's like becomes a real intellectual fact. Whereas if you have an actual sentence that you can read of like, he's able to run really, really fast or something like that, then I think it sinks into the more language acquisition part of your mind more. So I would say have a sentence somewhere on the front or the back, but you can experiment and see which one was best for you. I find there's pros and cons either way. And it also helps if you can have audio on the card as well, but that gets a little more complicated, like, technical. You have to figure out a way to extract it and stuff. But
also, to your point, prepositions a lot of times are like notoriously difficult to understand if you're just using a native language translation. Like, here's the word as, but it can also mean in, and it can mean at, and by, and with, depending on the context. And we use all these little prepositions in slightly different ways. And like a little preposition will have a lot of different uses.
So for things like that, you look at the definition. If you're not a linguist, it's not going to mean anything to you. But if you look at an example sentence, it actually can make things clear really quickly. So I think there was a really good line from antimoon.com that was like, the definition doesn't help you understand the example sentence. The example sentence helps you understand the definition.
Yeah, that's I like that quote. Stephanie Field said, years of flashcards sounds tiring. Is it really necessary when improving towards an advanced level?
It's certainly not necessary. Lots of people have gotten really good at a foreign language without it. Obviously, most of us don't use a flashcard system in learning our native language. But really, like for me, like I said, it was something that I would do for like an hour a day, and generally. So, I mean, that still was a big commitment, and it was a lot of time. And I eventually dropped it because I felt like my Japanese got to the point where I didn't need it anymore. And the only things I was learning were super obscure things that most natives don't know. So I think that the SRS or the flashcard system plays different roles at different stages of the process. Like in the very beginning, it can be really hard to remember words in the language because your brain has no framework for it, right? It's easy to learn a word in your native language because we already have this whole infrastructure related to how phonemes work and morphemes and all these things. But in a foreign language, it can be like memories are more slippery. It can be really hard to remember words. So the flashcard system helps with that. When then you get a little bit better and you get to this point where memorizing words isn't as hard, but the words you're learning are still really common. They're showing up all the time. And so you don't need the flashcard system as much because you can kind of learn from you can just remember things because they're coming up so much. Then you start learning words that are pretty rare and you may only see them a couple times a year. And for that, then the SRS becomes more helpful again because it's really hard otherwise. And I think that if you're just someone who reads a lot, like if you start spending an hour a day reading in a foreign language, within 10 years, you're going to have the same vocabulary as a native. But if you want to take that 10-year process and shrink it down to like 2 or 3 years, then the SRS can allow you to do that. It is a lot of work. It does get grindy, but if you put in the effort, it does give results.
Sure. Yeah, I remember a few years back, I was using this website called freerice.com. I think that's what it was called. And basically, it's to help you expand your vocabulary in English. And I'm like, well, I'm a native speaker of English, but this website would automatically adjust your level to whatever, it would adjust the difficulty to whatever level your English is at. And I'm a native speaker, but I swear I was learning words every day on this website because it's just like you're never done.
Yeah, like that. When I started learning Japanese, I really got into this mindset of kind of paying attention to how much I was understanding. Like I was always asking myself as I was reading, like, am I actually understanding all of this? Do I know all these words? And after a while, it started carried over to English, and I realized, when I'm reading a real book in English, there's words I don't know showing up all the time. Usually you just kind of infer what they mean from context. You don't really worry about it. But yeah, when you, I don't think most native speakers are actually like there's this illusion that you were like, know everything, but almost none of us really do.
Right. So one of the apps that I've been using is Memrise. And I'm just trying to learn the most common words in Thai. Is there some reason that you prefer Anki over other SRS apps?
Well, Anki is pretty much the most versatile. It is really flexible. You can design card templates any way you want, and you can tweak the algorithm and things like this. And there's also a lot of add-ons. So just like how, there's Chrome extensions, people make add-ons for Anki that add in a lot of functionality. Mm-hmm. And so, like, for example, the way I've been making cards for Chinese is there's this open source video player called MPV, which also allows scripts. And so there's an Anki add-on in combination with an MPV script that basically allows you to make cards within a couple seconds, within just a few button presses, that include the audio, because it actually, like if I'm watching a Chinese drama with Chinese subtitles, it looks at the subtitle file to see when a certain subtitle line starts and stops, clips the audio for that segment, adds it to the card. So I have these cards that have the actual original audio, and they only take a couple seconds to make. So there's no way you're going to be able to do that with Memrise, basically.
Right.
But what I would say is, like in Memrise, it sounds like you're using a deck that someone else made for the most common words. So in that case, it doesn't really matter. In fact, most SRSs use the same algorithm. It's called the SM2 algorithm. It was created in 1998 by this guy Woz, who invented the first SRS. So the algorithm is probably literally the same, and so it doesn't really matter. But what I'd say is, once you start getting to the point where you're making your own cards out of the particular things that came up in your immersion, that's when Anki is going to be a lot better, because it's the easiest to make cards. It's the most flexible. It's really built for that. Whereas Memrise is probably going to be pretty clunky to try to make your own cards. And so the reason to use Anki from the beginning is just get more comfortable with it, so that eventually when it comes time to make your own cards, you're already familiar with the program. But I would say if you're already going with Memrise, that's totally fine to keep going with that for now.
Cool. All right. And I'm going to take one last question here from Devin. It says, I've been using the Ikana method, which I'm not... Are you familiar with the Ikana method?
Ikana is a YouTuber who talks about language learning, but I don't know the details of what his method is.
I don't either. So maybe if someone in the chat knows, you can enlighten us. But Devin says, I've been using the Ikana method, which has been absolutely amazing and has gotten me to a low B2 in Spanish. But now I feel a plateau. Any specific advice for what's next?
Well, so that actually, I do know a little bit about Ikana's methodology, and I would say one of the first things I said in this live stream is I went over this framework of skill building versus input-based method, input-based learning. And I'd say probably what you've been doing is, it sounds like you're describing exactly what I described at the beginning of this live stream. I was talking about how for languages that are close to your native language, the skill building approach works really well up until a certain point where you're going to kind of hit a wall. And then if you want to go forward, you're going to have to kind of switch over to input-based learning. So I would recommend skipping to the beginning of this live stream and watching that recording.
There you go. All right, cool. Well, it looks like we've reached the end of our questions here. So thanks so much for coming on my channel and having a chat, man.
Oh, yeah, my pleasure. It was fun.
Yeah, cool. I'm going to definitely put into practice some of the things that we talked about in here. So thanks to everyone for watching. And so your website is refold.la.
LA, yeah. And then my YouTube channel is Matt vs. Japan.
All right, cool. And I will link to those in the description of this video for anyone interested. Anyways, cool. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much.
I'd love to have you, collaborate again sometime in the future if you're ever interested.
Yeah,
in that.
anytime.
Cool. Talk to you later. I'm gonna...